On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, sinking 19 U.S. naval vessels and killing more than 2,000 soldiers.
No matter how long it may take us.
The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. World War II was no longer just Europe's war.
And their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
America's entry into the war had a galvanizing effect on its moribund atomic bomb effort. President Roosevelt approved production of the weapon and turned the nuclear program over to the Army. Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, an expert engineer and administrator, was placed at the head of the Manhattan Engineer District, named after the project's initial headquarters in New York City.
General Groves, having just finished building the Pentagon, was absolutely disgusted to be assigned the Manhattan Project, as it came to be called. He was sure it was a boondoggle. He was sure you could never do such a thing.
But at the University of Chicago, Szilard and Fermi were taking the first steps in proving Groves wrong. They were trying to demonstrate that the fission process could be harnessed by launching a sustained chain reaction in uranium. They built the first primitive reactor in a squash court beneath the stands of the university's football stadium. The reactor consisted of a pile in which a fission reaction could be initiated and controlled.
They did it by piling layers of graphite and then embedding balls of uranium, so that when the neutrons started flying through, they would be slowed by the graphite, collide with the uranium, release more neutrons, and those neutrons would continue in the chain reaction pattern.
This momentous achievement, only detectable by a Geiger counter, meant that the fission process could be sustained. Nuclear energy could be released in a controlled way, as in a reactor, or perhaps cataclysmically, as in a bomb.
It was so crazy that you could put a bunch of uranium together with graphite and the thing would spring to life.
The bomb effort went into high gear. Its first priority was the lack of weapons-grade fuel. Fission is more readily produced in a rare uranium isotope, uranium-235, that occurs naturally at a ratio of 1 to 139 to its less useful twin, uranium-238. Chemically identical, the isotopes were almost impossible to separate. The only workable method in 1942 was electromagnetic separation. In this process, a mass spectrometer used for separating electrically charged particles according to their mass sent a stream of uranium atoms past a magnet. Atoms of the lighter isotope U-235 would be deflected more than those of the heavier U-238 and would be captured one atom at a time. Scientists at Columbia University championed a competing mode of separation, gaseous diffusion. This method passed the isotope through a porous barrier that separated the lighter isotope from its heavier counterpart, but it proved to be technically challenging.
In a square centimeter, about the size of my thumbnail, you've got to have hundreds of millions of pores, and they have to all be the same size. If they're too big, the gas flows through without any separation. If they're too small, the gas gets in there and condenses on the surface, won't go through. So you talk about obstacles.
But if a suitable barrier could be manufactured, it promised a greater yield than the electromagnetic process. Both techniques would have to be done on a massive scale and would prove extremely costly. And if they worked, they would provide fuel for a bomb that would be designed in a remote area of New Mexico. Groves selected a bomb design site in Los Alamos, an isolated location in the mountains at an elevation of 7,000 feet and accessible by only one road.
General Groves wanted it to be inland, too far for enemy planes or submarines. He wanted it to be beautiful, where he said he could keep a bunch of prima donnas amused.
In November of 1942, the Army purchased 54,000 acres for $440,000 under the guise of using them as a demolition range. To head up the installation, Groves, an expert judge of men, chose a most unlikely candidate, J. Robert Oppenheimer. A gifted physics professor, Oppenheimer had a reputation for being temperamental, perhaps not suited to a highly stressful assignment.
Grove was advised that Oppenheimer would be a disaster. People told him that Oppenheimer couldn't run a hot dog stand.
Oppenheimer was a fascinating and complicated man. Fundamentally, he seems to have had some of the qualities of an actor. He was different things to different people.
Oppenheimer drew luminaries like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, and Edward Teller to the facility, as well as technicians fresh out of college. Laboratory personnel grew from 250 in 1943 to 2,500 in 1945.
There were lots of babies born. General Groves at one point asked Oppenheimer if he couldn't do something about that. He said he didn't think so. The one place that they had to keep expanding was the maternity ward at the hospital.
During the fall of 1942, the theoretical physicists at Los Alamos began the difficult process of trying to determine how much U-235 it would take to make a bomb.
And the scientists tell him, well, it could be X amount, but that's plus or minus by a factor of 10. Groves is absolutely staggered. He uses the illustration that, well, you're giving a wedding, and you say it's for 100 people, but maybe 1,000 will turn up, or maybe 10. So how can you make any sort of plans with that range?
This kind of uncertainty only served to fuel fears that the Nazis might be closer to building a bomb.